I would like to welcome you to today's Cutter Transportation webcast entitled Media Framing of Fatal Bicyclist Crashes in Hillsborough County, a Critical Discourse Analysis. We have two presenters today, Ms. Julie Bond and Ms. Erin Sheffels. Let me tell you a little bit more about Erin and Julie before I hand it over to them. So Julie is a senior research associate here at the Center for Urban Transportation Research with over 20 years of experience in transportation demand management programs and bicycle and pedestrian safety research. She serves as a principal investigator for multiple research projects and manages the local Tampa Bay pedestrian bicyclist safety programs. She has a Master's of Public Administration from USF and a BS in Business Administration from Southern Utah University. Ms. Erin Sheffels just recently, last month, earned her PhD in communications at the University of South Florida. Her areas of interest include health communication, end-of-life communication, relational communication, and she works with Julie on pedestrian and safety, bicyclist safety issues on the Bike and Walk Tampa Bay program on qualitative media study. So with that being said, I am going to hand the next little bit of time over to Erin and Julie. Julie, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you very much, Stephanie. Tampa, a man wearing dark clothing and riding a bicycle was killed when he was hit by a car early Sunday on Hillsborough Avenue. The accident happened about 5 a.m. at the intersection of Lois Avenue. Jerome Thomas, 44, was riding a bike north across Hillsborough Avenue, about 300 feet west of the intersection, when he was hit by a car in the eastbound lanes, according to Tampa police. Thomas died at the scene. The car's driver, Lorenzo Rodriguez, 57, was not issued any traffic citations, police said. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Media Framing of Fatal Bicyclist Crashes in Hillsborough County, a Critical Discourse Analysis. Stephanie provided introductions for both Dr. Sheffels and I, but I'd like to introduce one of our third authors, Lorraine Montague. And Lorraine has a PhD in communication from the University of South Florida, a Master of Liberal Studies from Rollins College, and a bachelor's degree from the College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Florida. She is not on this webinar today, but we'd like to thank her for her contributions to this study. This research examines the linguistic choices that frame relationships between bicyclists and other parties involved in fatal crash events. Textual data was collected from media reports of all bicyclist fatalities that occurred from January 2009 through June 2018 in Hillsborough County, Florida. Hillsborough County, Florida has a high number of bicyclist deaths compared to other areas of the U.S. The media reports were coded with a qualitative data analysis software, and then we analyzed them using critical discourse analysis. We'll refer to that as CDA, and it's a rigorous qualitative method to analyze oral and written communication. So through CDA, our study examines how linguistic choices produce meaning and reinforce the common sense or taken for granted lexicon of transportation. I'm going to start with giving you a little bit of background before I turn it over to Erin on the site of the study. The site of the study is Hillsborough County, where we are also located, and Hillsborough County has a population of just over 1.4 million. It's the county seat and largest city in Tampa, and other cities include Temple Terrace and Plant City. The number of bicyclist fatalities occurring in Hillsborough County make it an appropriate site for transportation inquiry, and this gives us the potential to provide insight into bicyclist fatalities and potential countermeasures statewide and also nationwide. While pedestrian fatalities in the county also follow a similar trend and represent a higher percentage of traffic-related deaths, our study focuses on bicyclist deaths as a primary exploration of transportation safety. So in Hillsborough County, bicyclist fatalities were frequently reported by the media, and this yielded a comprehensive data set through which to begin our research about deadly traffic crashes. A majority of the bicyclist deaths were reported as male on the police reports. Sex identification, along with age, are both ways to identify someone beyond the label of bicyclist. And so Erin will discuss this further later in the presentation, but I wanted to show you this chart. And also of importance is age. And this chart illustrates the age distribution within our data set of 94 fatalities. The largest percentage was in a combined age range of 40 to 59, and the second largest was in the age range of 10 to 29 years. Now this image shows the locations of the bicycle fatality crash, and over half the fatalities occurred in unincorporated Hillsborough County. And then this second image shows the actual location of the bicyclists by their place of residence. So this is really important because almost all of the bicycle fatalities had a local address. We also mapped drivers' addresses, so their residence, and it's also important to note that almost all the drivers had local addresses. So now I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Erin Sheffels, and she will talk about what we found in this research. So Erin, I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Julie. In this study, we've examined language for its working parts as if through a metaphorical microscope. Dr. Harvey Sachs, a famous sociologist whose work in ethnomethodology pioneered methods like CDA, says language does something in the same ways that atoms do things. And I'm paraphrasing him here, but he says that we don't need to worry so much about what people are thinking. We should worry instead about what's right in front of us, which is what people say and how we say it. Sachs compares language to atoms. We know atoms do things, and they do not have very good brains, he says. Research shows that our perceptions of road traffic risks are influenced as much by media reporting as by our personal experiences and perceptions of risk. So to thoroughly account for public understandings of bicyclist fatalities, it is important to examine the language in news reports about these fatal crashes. For this, we chose critical discourse analysis, or CDA, a method used by discourse analysts and linguists to expose the subtleties of language and its function in relation to social structures. Emily Badger is an author for the Washington Post who wrote about the word accident in an opinion piece in 2015. And she says that accident is inaccurate because it removes responsibility and also the potential for change or reform. It is unavoidable, is the presumption. While on the other hand, Magusin says the words crash and collision might imply equal force on impact between bicycles and motor vehicles, which is also inaccurate and problematic in her opinion. Some may scoff at the idea that language does anything. Some of the comments posted after Badger's Washington Post article argued that the use of the word accident was no different from the use of the word crash, and that microscopic language choices such as these do not impact reality. Ironically, their comments were passionate and they sustained arguments with others who disagreed with them, suggesting that language does in fact matter. Language shapes our perceptions of reality. This means that language also shapes reality. We act upon objects in coordinated ways based on language comprehension. This is how humans work together. We know language shapes perception because when we process it, 4 parts of the brain light up, and one of those parts is working memory. And this is our brain's immediate perceptual processing mechanism. The following elements of language are parts of Norman Fairclough's comprehensive procedure for critical discourse analysis. Fairclough is considered a founder of this method, and it can be applied to both the written and the spoken word. However, in this case, we're only examining the written word. Classification schemes include vocabulary choices. For instance, the word accident is a classification and is an ideologically contested word, as we know from Badger's article and the corresponding comments section. We also looked at active versus passive sentences. In active sentences, the subject performs actions denoted by verbs, while in passive sentences, the subject is acted upon by the verb, so actions are emphasized instead of the actors. All of these parts of language affect our perceptions of agency. Agency is conscious action by a clear actor. And finally, we looked for nominalizations in the data, and these are verbs or adjectives that have been transformed into nouns. For example, investigate, a verb, becomes investigation, a noun. Fun fact, the word nominalization is itself a nominalization. These are often used in passive sentence constructions from an article in the New York Times called The Dark Side of Verbs as Nouns. Hitchings writes, "It's not just that nominalization can sap the vitality out of one's speech or prose. It can also eliminate context and mask any sense of agency. Furthermore, it can make something that is nebulous or fuzzy seem stable, mechanical, and precisely defined." For example, we're looking at frames. So that is one thing that defines the thing within the frame that we are examining. So we have this example here on the slide that is sort of a Victorian style frame, and if we put modern art in it, it will change the meaning of the art. If, for instance, this frame is very pricey and we have a photo of a person sleeping on the streets in it, the meaning of the photo changes pretty significantly. And frames can represent people, objects, and processes, as well as abstract concepts. According to Iyengar, there are two types of frames that the media use. One of them is episodic. It's the content framed as an episode. So while episodic frames are used to report the specific events and concrete circumstances of a crash or fatality, thematic frames present news that accentuates issues and events in a more general context. Thematic frames help us see something for its larger, big picture issues. So Iyengar studied people's responses to news reports and found that poverty was considered an individual's responsibility when articles were framed episodically. But when they were framed thematically, it was seen as a larger economic circumstance. Very different perceptions there. Finally, Fairclough writes the newspapers that they are texts that have hidden power. He says this type of power is exercised with nuances that aren't often considered by the reader. So examples include vocabulary and grammar and other stuff that we learn in grade school. He says news articles have hidden power that's in plain sight because it's considered common sense. The data for this study includes all bicyclist deaths that occurred from January of 2009 through June 2018 in Hillsborough County, Florida. The data were compiled using Florida's Integrated Report Exchange System, or FIRES, to document the number of reported fatalities. Data were verified using the Florida Department of Transportation District 7's Crash Data Management System. The information collected was used to filter the results on a database inquiry of local news sources that reported on incidents, including the Tampa Bay Times, the Tampa Tribune, the St. Petersburg Times, WSTP 10 News, Bay News 9, Fox 13 Tampa Bay, WUSF Public Media, and ABC Action News. The terms are displayed on the slide, and the results were filtered by the month and year of each death. All published stories were collected, excluding the data from blogs or non-official news sources. Stories were converted to a PDF file format and imported into our qualitative analysis software, and all news reports referenced in this research are part of the public domain. Fairclough's procedure for discourse analysis was used, as mentioned before, for coding the data. We're going to go into more detail about that now. Coding categories or nodes were created based on Fairclough's general categories of experiential and expressive nodes. Experiential codes are focused on vocabulary, words and wording, classifications, grammar, and sentence structure. Expressive codes focus on the ways that producers of text evaluate subjects, identities, and outcomes. Based on this organization, we made general, parent, and child nodes to start the process. This figure represents our coding, starting from experiential and going into the expressive nodes. So 2 trained coders ran queries for vocabulary using the software described earlier and coded the categories of vocabulary. Also, grammar was coded, and this can be coded objectively based on rules for grammar that are standardized. The episodic articles also were coded for themes, though they had no significant codes beyond grammar and vocabulary. So we did see articles that had other themes and codes, so we open-coded those articles, and that's how we found our thematic set of data. So the results of the study show that the majority of news reports are episodic and not thematic, focusing on the traffic event and the parties involved in the crash, particularly the bicyclist. Vocabulary, grammatical structure, and narrative framing of news reports largely function to remove blame from the motorist and also to highlight the bicyclist's actions. These linguistic choices reflect an assumption that responsibility for safety rests on the bicyclist and detracts from attention from potential social policy reform that may lead to fewer bicyclist fatalities. A minority of articles were written with thematic frames, and those were focused on broader issues like social capital, safety education, and advocacy, which Julia will discuss later. This is an example of an article that uses the word accident. And we show over here on the side the different word choices that were named as possible in the articles or that we saw at least once or twice as we coded the data. Accident was used fairly frequently. In terms of grammar and agency, in almost all of the articles, motorist agency was eliminated from the story in a variety of ways. So in 55 of 189 of the sources, the motorist was replaced at least once with the word truck, usually multiple times within a source, totaling 111 references to a truck as an agent in bicyclist deaths. In addition to the 55 trucks that are given agency in the data, cars are also agents in 50 other articles, and the word car is referenced a total of 138 times. More generally, the word vehicle was used in place of motorist 103 times over 70 of the articles. And then more specifically, the make and the model of the vehicle was the descriptor of the agent in 97 articles and was referenced a total of 106 times. This is an example of passive and active sentence constructions and shows the same article that was used before to show the word accident. And we can kind of see here how these things are working together to frame what is an episodic article. Besides using the vocabulary that contains assumptions about responsibility and also grammar, the episodic articles revealed a strong relationship between bicyclist class and bicyclist safety. So, for instance, in this first example, Anthony Weeks was riding against traffic, which is illegal, also considered unsafe, and in the same sentence, there's an association with his vocation, which is a landscaping job. These are identity markers of socioeconomic status. Another way to look at the socioeconomic identity of someone is to describe their living conditions or the location of their homes. As the second example does, But when bicyclists are of a higher status, they are more often portrayed as having practiced safe behaviors at the time of their deaths, as in the case of Kayoka Ishizuka, who is a cancer researcher, was a cancer researcher at the University of South Florida. This is the third example on the slide. As the results of our research indicate, the narrative of each bicyclist fatality is typically delivered in one or two short paragraphs and originates from a third-person point of view. This is the episodic story. The third-person perspective is appropriate for this kind of storytelling. A reporter writes from outside the scene and from the perspective of a third party who responded to the scene. Most fatalities make the news, but not all of them, as is true of the data for this project. Our literature demonstrates that bicyclist fatalities are considered dramatic events, usually more so than injuries of the same nature. And they may be reported on more frequently than other traffic-related stories as a result. But since Tampa has a higher fatality rate than other places, sometimes bicyclist deaths create a predicament of ordinariness for news outlets. Ben Montgomery, a Bike Walk Tampa Bay board member and former reporter for Tampa Bay Times, also a professor of journalism, commented that this was a difficult issue for Tampa's area journalists to address because their job is to report on subjects of interest. If bicyclist deaths are ordinary, then they're not newsworthy. But if bicyclist deaths seem extraordinary, then countermeasures may be superfluous. So there's sort of a paradox there. According to our results, the story of the dead bicyclist is primarily episodic and lacks both extraordinary and ordinary qualities, but it can be changed. If writers attempt to find balance between opposing merits such as ordinariness and extraordinariness, the report can become more newsworthy and escape an either-or dichotomy, and it becomes more balanced in this way. So it would include more relevant facts as well as grammar and vocab conscious descriptions of the event. And it would also reach beyond the episode and into the institutional structures that shape it. For instance, infrastructure, public safety education, etc. If this is done while attending to the episode as a tragedy and showing readers the human thread that runs through it, the story changes, and perhaps the cultural story then changes as well, and perhaps even the numbers over time. So schemata are part of the ways that we make sense of stories. So it's an outlined way of thinking that's common to a culture. So schemata are tools of perception. They're mental shortcuts. They allow us to exercise appropriate and efficient behaviors that are required for survival within our culture. Bonham links a culture of efficiency with modal choice, and she writes that certainly transport behavioralists have examined a range of factors which might influence the modal choices people make. However, transport experts continue to comprehend them in the framework of the efficient journey. And this is evident somewhat in the data when we look at the episodic stories about fatalities that also mention traffic delays, lane and road closures, and the impact a person's death had on traffic. Though this wasn't a significant result, it was something that recurred in the data enough to take note in the discussion of it. So a schematic focus on efficiency in transportation is lost when we look at the schema of a hit and run. So that's something else that kind of made itself, known in the data, but not enough to be significant. But it prompts readers to think of the crash or the fatality in a different way. So now they're considering the legal and ethical sanctions of a crime when it's framed in terms of a hit-and-run crash. So the hit-and-run story is generally more thematic, and the episodic hit-and-run stories call the public for help to solve the crime. So this creates a different way of responding to the story. So it's perceptual. Also, we're looking at social identities, which they can be perceived in a number of ways. Julie mentioned this in the beginning when she talked about age and sex. Identity markers are visible ways that you're identified and categorized by others in their attempt to understand their surroundings and your place in them. So when a person is riding a bicycle, one identity marker is the bicycle, while others are attire, like we said, gender, age, body composition, socioeconomic status, etc. All of those traits can stigmatize a bicyclist on the roadway. So it's important to know also that in our data, most of the deaths occurred in lower income areas near the bicyclist home. And then finally, scripts are autopilot ways that we communicate just to be efficient. Police report forms are limited by the fields that the officers must fill out with predetermined limited options. So these are the scripts that are used to establish fault in these fatal crashes. So what we recommend to start a creative conversation that might begin to prevent perceiving fatalities or deaths in ways that aren't useful. We've devised some linguistic strategies that can change the ways that we look at them, for those who are interested only, of course. As the data have established, the episodic stories might frame the deaths as natural, a series of accidents that happen and are just a part of the order of things. Meanwhile, Hillsborough County has taken great strides to prevent these deaths in the past 10 to 15 years, yet they continue to occur at the same rate. According to Bike Walk Tampa Bay, a coalition of community partners that formed in 2015, what is desired is cultural change. The results of this study indicate that news reports and language use may impact the ways in which our institutions and public are willing or able to catalyze positive change at the cultural level. So what we are recommending for those who want to be more language cautious is to use active language and avoid nominalizations, and also be vocabulary conscious to thinking about what a word means and if it is accurate given the purposes of what's being written. Also, we're suggesting that episodes or these very brief fact-based reports are supplemented with themes that are applicable. There's plenty to be taught in terms of safety, and there can be, depending on what has happened, each is a unique circumstance, a way to talk about how it could be prevented. So we would like to talk about some opportunities for thematic framing then. And a significant portion of our data were thematic framed stories, so 56 of 189 of them were. And this suggests that our bicyclist fatalities happen for reasons that can be prevented, and that the prevalence of bicyclist fatalities in Hillsborough County is undesirable as well. And this is evidenced by the very prominent social actors that are in these thematic articles. So people who are bicyclist advocates, political figures and organizations, engineers, law enforcement, planners, etc. And thematic frames in the data set highlighted issues that were associated with three things: social capital, safety education, and bicycle advocacy. And now I'm going to turn the time over to Julie to talk about these.
Thank you, Erin. So social capital garners respect by adding value to the bicyclist through association with, for example, family, professional, communal, and friendship networks. So, and other forms of social capital come from a person's standing in the community, and it could be their socioeconomic status and the connections to others that status affords them. So both examples on this slide, if you notice, are quotes from thematic news articles that illustrate social capital through family networks, and really the deep-seated grief that is suffered by real people when bicyclists die and leave loved ones behind. So I'll read one of the quotes. Brian was an 11-year-old boy. Brian's mother said the family was close. The boys shared a bunk bed. Brian had the top where a big stuffed green frog remains. Along with an open book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Dante listed his brother's favorite things: basketball and the colors red, blue, and black. What did he like most? Me, Dante said. So that's an example of social capital. Next, I'll talk a little bit about safety education, and I have three quotes from news articles on the slide. So bicyclist advocates and local transportation leadership, they work to inform the public of cyclist legal rights. They also garner political support for the protection of cyclists on Hillsborough County roads. And an example in an article quoting Gina Torres from the Hillsborough County MPO says, "The solution is not just to try and rid the roads of bicyclists and put them on a trail," she said. "A bicyclist is a vehicle." We'll next move on to bicycle advocacy. Advocacy and awareness are really very important elements of public health education and make the safety needs of cyclists known. So bicycle advocates and local transportation leadership is very important. They work to inform the public of cyclists' legal rights and garner political support for the protection of cyclists on Hillsborough County roads. For example, advocates often stress the legal status of the bicycle as a vehicle deserving of its own infrastructure. And I have two examples from news articles. For one example said, "The bikes are personal memorials honoring the dead, but they're also symbols, part of an international movement aimed at reminding motorists to watch out for bicyclists." And then I want to talk a little bit about linguistic strategies for reporting bicyclist deaths. So some of the linguistic strategies could be to reframe the bicyclist to shift from blaming the individual toward a focus on social action and policy reform. And Erin spoke about this on her slides. Second, more thematic frames to humanize bicyclists and contextualize traffic events in law, infrastructures, attitudes, environments, and others. And finally, active versus passive constructions will clarify agency and responsibility. So these are just a few of the linguistic strategies for reporting bicyclist deaths. And in conclusion, I want to talk a little bit about future research. So future research from the study could include looking at why certain bicyclist fatality cases are not covered by the media. Second, comparing coverage of bicyclist fatalities in other geographic locations. We only looked at Hillsborough County. We had a complete data set for almost 10 years, but this could be compared with bicycle fatalities in other geographic locations. Third, comparing or looking at differences in urban environments, looking at infrastructure, and also looking at law enforcement policies. And finally, we could analyze sources of documents like police report forms and written legislations. So all of this is important and could be part of future research from this research project that we have conducted. And again, thank you. That is the conclusion of our research. And Erin and I are available now to answer any questions that you may have regarding this research.
Thank you so much, Julie and Erin, for the great and informative presentation. Before we sort of open up the floor for questions, I would like to remind everybody how to ask a question. The Q&A box is located on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Simply type in any questions or comments that you have, and we will be happy to read those out loud and get Julie and Erin to respond. So we do have a number of questions already in the queue. So Julie, let's get started. Would you expect to see a difference in the framing relative to injuries versus fatalities?
Hi, Charles. That's a good question. One thing that we found is that the injuries are very seldom reported in the news. Really recently, one was a mother was injured on Beta Bay, and this made news. And I think that that's likely because it's a very uncommon identity, social identity to see in this sort of circumstance. And there was some local outrage about that. So, but otherwise, we don't see a lot of injuries in the news.
Okay. Thank you. And then there's a question that comes in and says, is the final report available yet that we can share?
Okay, thanks for that question, Angie. The full report will be available in about 2 weeks, and this research was funded by the National Center for Transit Research, and it will be posted in entirety on that website. We'll also email it out. I have many requests for it, but it will be finalized and ready for viewing in about 2 weeks.
And then I'll just sort of piggyback on what Julie said is this webinar is being recorded. So we will, when we post the recording and then when the report is available on the Qatar website, we will also provide a link directly with the recording to the report. So both will be posted and available. So we'll make sure to keep that updated. The next question comes in and says, did you notice a consensus in framing across articles for certain authors? For instance, did author A consistently use episodic framing versus thematic framing?
Charles, again, that's a really good question. So the differences in terms of authorship are difficult to know about with our data because many of those episodic articles are just written by staff. Now, the thematic articles do show some consistencies with authorship, with 4 to 5 articles being written by the same author or authors. However, that's hard to draw too many conclusions from because, people come and go from different reporting jobs, and we can't really tell, that would be a psychological, like, why would they sort of cognitive research, and we don't do that. So.
And then this next kind of comment comes in and says, are there avenues for reaching media at large to retrain them?
I'm sorry?
Do you have any plans to reach out to the media to sort of retrain them in their verbiage that they're using?
Yeah, great question. So, we don't have interest in prescribing these language recommendations to anybody. They're just simply, at this point, available to those who are interested and are accessible now to the public. So it is our hope that this will be a conversation that catches fire and continues moving forward. And we also know that there are journalists whose interests are also aligned, with protecting bicyclists and everyone on the roadway. So those folks would be presumably interested.
Next question comes in and says, did you see the language change over the last almost 10-year period you analyzed, or did the reporting language remain the same?
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. Another great question. The language has been the same, but when a lot of high social capital deaths took place, beginning with Leroy Collins Jr., and many of you will recognize that name in 2010, there was a change. Thematic frames became more common, decreasing again. So it decreased again then in recent reports. So we did see somewhat of a change, and that was with, death of someone with social capital.
Okay. The next question says, why does the media coverage matter?
Okay. Well, media coverage does matter. It influences perceptions, and really it influences the conversations we have related to the traffic fatalities. And so, as many of you know, we read an article and everyone may be talking about it, or we may not be talking about it. So, for example, psychologically, we feel safe if we believe that our own behaviors are exempt from tragedy. So media really does matter, and the language that they use matters.
Okay. Right. So that means also that victim blaming is an easy way to feel as if we are exempt because, I don't cross the street that way. I don't ride a bicycle. I don't, fill in the blank, so I'm going to be okay.
We've got another comment. Comment comes in and says, excellent presentation, Erin and Julie, so kudos to you. And then the question sort of says, do you see any language trending that conveys speed and roadway design as elements, i.e., there was, I guess, an article this week in the Wall Street Journal citing tourists, alcohol, and elders and the top factors.
Yes, and We do see that, but generally it's in the context of the bicyclist choices. So, for instance, well, the speed limit on this road is 45, but there are no bike lanes, or the speed limit is 45 and the bike lanes are filled with debris, right? So we have that element of it embedded, but that's in terms of the thematically framed articles mostly. And then in the episodic articles, no, I mean, there's not a whole lot. Sometimes the speed that the person is going is reported, but it's often not. Mostly it's just the facts about the bicyclist, age, sex, where they lived, et cetera, and then later in the report at the very end usually that the motorist is named and there are no charges.
Okay. Okay, here comes another one. It says, has anyone ever done a ride-along with law enforcement during HVE grant? Would you be open to that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, absolutely, we would be open to that, and it would give. That's also a part of our going into this, right? We have no. We're not looking to blame, right? That's the entire premise of this study, is to stop placing blame on individuals and start looking at this as a larger issue that we can all work together on. So if we can work together on it, that's amazing, and that would be a great opportunity.
Okay. Our next question comes in and says, is there a correlation between race and ethnicity of the victim and the choice of framing?
That one is really good. Definitely that's something that seems to be happening, but that would be an inference at this point. We only would be able to know the race of an individual for sure if we looked at something other than the police report, but that was the data we were working from.
And then next question says, why do some people receive more media coverage than others?
Well, that goes back to social capital. So when we talked about people who, have these larger networks that come forth, for instance, the mother who just died, or if we look back to 2010 even, the most high-profile death was Leroy Collins Jr., and he had 21 articles written about him, and most of those articles were thematic and calling for advocacy and change and education. So that's likely why. That's what we would infer given the data.
Okay, and then the next question says, if the language changes, will the fatalities be reduced?
Okay, that's really a great question, and we're asked that many times. So really that's not predictable based on our particular study, but we do know that as our culture changes, language changes, and then vice versa. So, that's the answer that we have for that question.
Yeah, we see different language being created as our culture shifts. So if we look at gender, for instance, which has been a big part of our cultural conversation and a point of contention as well over time, we see how language has changed there as culture changed. So yeah, I think that example alone is evidence.
Right, and then this question has a question and then sort of follows up with a comment. It said, should we also examine language used by advocates and safety campaigns, i.e. much of the education messaging is directed at the roadway users, sort of like motorists, please don't use the road in a manner in which it was designed. Slow down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in any kind of program of that nature, it's important that we're looking at the audience and the way that we're adapting to that audience. So if what we want is to connect with people who are driving vehicles, then we need to put ourselves in the position of someone who is a motorist, because we are all motorists and bicyclists. Most of us tend to shift between those roles pretty fluidly, not everyone. But I think that's important to do.
And this one may be an interesting follow-up or place for extra studies says, it would be interesting to see if differences in framing used by local advocacy groups in blogs and the media at large. So that may be also something to consider in terms of further research.
Yes, Charles. I mean, this is a limited study. We just looked at bicyclist fatalities in Hillsborough County, but there's so many other opportunities to use critical discourse analysis to look at language in other ways, such as you suggest. So it's exciting to hear all the comments, and it's very interesting to see what you come up with. And so that's another one we could add onto our future research. And yes, I mean, all these comments are great, and those can be added to the list for future research. So, we'd love to talk to any of you that have an interest in looking at some of the ideas for future research.
Perfect. And Charles says he wants to team up. So if you could provide us, if you didn't provide us with your email address at the beginning, Charles, go ahead and provide it in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure that you connect with Julie and Aaron. And then lastly, I guess, I know you looked specifically at bicyclists, but any thought about looking at pedestrians, fatalities?
Yes, I mean, we've thought about that a lot because, for example, last year in Hillsborough County there were 12 bicyclist fatalities and 50 pedestrian fatalities. There would be it would be an extensive research project, though, because we had to have the names of the bicyclists in order to find their media reports. And so that's something else to consider, that what we did, pulling all of the media reports, took quite a bit of research, finding their names and then finding the news articles that were related to them. And we really did have a complete data set because we were able to do that. We would love to do that with pedestrian fatalities. It would just, it takes some time to find those media reports, but, it can be done, and we would love to look at that.
It's also interesting because pedestrian deaths are reported on in the media less, so it would be a good focus to look at those reports and kind of think about the language and the differences between pedestrian reports and bicyclist reports to kind of see what's happening there.
Okay. Yeah, and geographic areas are going to be much different, so that would also be very interesting to compare with the different geographic locations and see the differences between what's happening here in Florida.
Okay. Perfect. Julie and Aaron, thank you so much for the great presentation, and to all of our audience for the great questions. I'm going to go ahead and open up the evaluation. As I mentioned during the introduction, the feedback included that you provide in the evaluation is not only super important to Julie and Aaron, but also to the team that works on the Cutter Transportation webcast series. So if you could just take not more than 3 minutes to complete that evaluation, and if there's something you'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about, either a topic or a speaker, we would love for you to provide that information as well. And like I said, we will make sure that this webinar was recorded and that the link to the report will also be provided right with that recording. So with that being said, we do have another Cutter Transportation webcast scheduled in 2 weeks from today. Oops, that is not what they're talking about. I'm sorry, I forgot to change the title. Let me pull up the title real quick so I can tell you exactly what Alex, Austin, and Jacob will be speaking about. So just give me just a quick second. I do apologize that was my mistake. So they will be speaking about building an alternative fuel bus program, funding opportunities, and best practices for transit agencies. So Alex, Austin, and Jacob will be speaking about alternative fuels programs. So again, thank you so much to Julie and Aaron for the great presentation, and we'll see you all in 2 weeks.